How a millionaire's ego was humbled by a simple man and a waitress. I never thought my life would change over coffee and toast. Sitting in Marlene's Diner, a restaurant situated at the heart of Texas City, wearing a work shirt faded by 5 years of sweat and effort, I was just trying to disappear into the background. It wasn't hard. This place, like my life, was simple. The smell of frying bacon, the hiss of the griddle, mugs clinking together. It all felt like the steady beat of a heart that didn't need much. Before we move further, please ensure to like, share, and subscribe for heartwarming stories like this. Likewise, tell us where you are watching from in the comment below. My son, Ethan, sat beside me in the corner booth, his legs swinging under the table, barely reaching the floor. He was busy coloring, his crayon moving furiously across the paper. The picture was a house, our house. I couldn't help but smile as he added another tree, a bigger backyard, and a garden for tomatoes. "We're gonna live in it someday, Dad," he said, his voice filled with that kind of certainty only a kid can have. I looked at the drawing. It was beautiful. Perfect, really. But the reality of our tiny apartment, where even Ethan's bike had trouble fitting, was far from the dream he was drawing. I never wanted to crush his spirit, though. "Yeah, buddy," I said, keeping my voice steady. "We'll have that house someday. A big backyard, just like you want." I watched him beam. That kid had dreams that could light up the world if he had the chance. Me? I was just trying to make sure we had enough for the next day. Lisa, the waitress, came over to our booth with her usual smile. She was a single mom too, raising her daughter on tips, doing her best to juggle it all. Tired, but still kind, there was a quiet strength about her that I'd always respected. "Refill for you, James?" "And a chocolate milk for the artist?" she asked as she set the drinks down. "Thanks, Lisa," I said, nodding. She turned to Ethan, peering over his drawing. "That's a really good house, buddy. Is that where you're going to live someday?" Ethan's face lit up. "Yeah, with a backyard, and I can have a treehouse in it. And a garden for tomatoes." He looked at Lisa, his eyes sparkling with hope. "You can come visit. We'll have a barbecue, and you can have the biggest slice of pie." Lisa laughed softly, the sound warm and genuine. "That sounds perfect." But I could see it in her eyes, that quiet flicker of something more. Maybe it was the weight of her own struggles, the gap between dreams and reality that she'd learned to live with. I couldn't help but admire the way she made it look easy. She'd been working here for years, serving the same faces day in and day out. But she never let it harden her. She still saw people, still treated them with the respect they deserved, even when they were just like her, struggling to stay afloat. "Thanks, Lisa," I said quietly. I took a sip of my coffee, letting the bitterness settle in my chest. It was a small moment, really. A routine morning in a small diner. Nothing special. But something in that simple exchange made me realize that maybe this, just this, was enough for now. Maybe it was all we needed. A small corner of the world where dreams were still possible, even if they felt just out of reach. As I looked at Ethan, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Maybe things would change. Maybe it wouldn't take much. Just a little bit of hope, and maybe a lot of courage. And it was right here, in this diner, over coffee and toast, that it all began to shift. The bell above the door jingled with the unmistakable sound of someone stepping into the diner. I didn't look up immediately. The place was still half empty, and the morning routine was soothing. Just me, Ethan, and the clink of mugs and silverware. I took another sip of my coffee, the bitter warmth settling in as I tried to focus on the kid beside me. Ethan was lost in his drawing, oblivious to the world around him. But then I felt it, the change in the air. A shift, something unspoken. The atmosphere in Marlene's diner had just thickened, and I knew exactly why. I didn't need to look up, but I did anyway. There he was, Alexander Wood, the kind of man who could walk into a room and make it feel like everyone else was invisible. He was tall, sharply dressed, every inch of him a polished facade of success and entitlement. He had that confident, almost cocky stride, like the floor was his to walk on, and the rest of us were just living in it. He didn't glance around, didn't notice the people in the diner, didn't care. Without breaking his pace, he took a seat at the counter, his tailored jacket stretching across his shoulders as he slid onto the stool with an air of self-importance. He looked like someone who believed he belonged in places like this, but only to show everyone else what they didn't have, what they could never have. "Coffee. Black," he barked to Lisa, not even looking up from his phone. It wasn't a request, it was a command. Lisa's back stiffened, but she didn't flinch. She was good at what she did, and years of dealing with people like him had taught her how to hold her ground. She turned without a word and walked over to the coffee pot. As she refilled his cup, I could hear the muffled sound of his phone call. "I don't care what it costs," he said, his voice deliberately loud enough for the entire diner to hear. "Buy out the whole block if you have to. These people will sell eventually. Everyone has a price." The words cut through the air, and for a moment, I saw a shift in Lisa's expression. She set the coffee pot down with a soft clink and turned back to the counter. Her face was calm, but there was a coldness in her eyes now, a change I hadn't seen before. It was subtle, but unmistakable. A woman who had learned how to handle these types of men, and one who had learned to push back when it was needed. Ethan, still coloring beside me, glanced up innocently, his little face full of curiosity. "Dad," he whispered, his voice just above a murmur, "is Mr. Wood talking about Mrs. Wilson's house?" I felt a jolt of discomfort. Mrs. Wilson had lived on our block for as long as I could remember, an elderly woman who'd taught half the town's kids, who knew everyone's story, even if she didn't always share her own. She was one of those people who made this town feel like a community. And now, she was about to lose the house she'd lived in for decades, all because someone like Alexander would have decided that progress meant wiping out the old to build something newer, something better for him. I turned to Ethan, trying to sound casual, to ease the weight of his question. "Yeah, but I think he is," I said quietly, my eyes never leaving Wood's profile. He was too busy with his phone, too busy barking orders to the people on the other end of that call, to even notice the ripple he was causing in the room. But Lisa had noticed. She didn't say anything at first, but the longer she stood there, the more I could see the tension in her posture. She was moving slower now, more deliberate, as though she was carefully choosing her next words, measuring how far she could go before it all broke. But she wasn't the kind of person who could let something like this slide. Not today. Not when someone's home was on the line. As she poured a refill into Wood's cup, she paused for just a moment, as if to gather herself. And then, she spoke. "Excuse me, Mr. Wood," she said, her voice calm but edged with something sharper. "Those properties you're talking about? They're people. Real people. People who have memories there. People who don't have anywhere else to go." Wood didn't even flinch. He was so used to being in control, so used to dismissing anyone who stood in his way, that he barely acknowledged her. He glanced at her briefly, his gaze cold and dismissive, and then returned to his phone call. "That's progress, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs." Lisa's eyes narrowed. There was a stillness to her that wasn't lost on me. She wasn't backing down. "My name is Lisa, not sweetheart," she said firmly. "And those eggs you're breaking," she pointed subtly at the diner, her hand just hovering over the coffee pot. "They have names, too, and lives, and memories." There was a brief moment where I thought Wood might take her seriously. But I was wrong. His eyes hardened, and he let out a humorless laugh. "Lisa, was it?" He leaned back in his stool, spreading his arms wide as though he were enjoying some private joke. "Well, Lisa, perhaps you should stick to pouring coffee and leave the business to those who actually understand it." The room went still for a moment, the kind of silence that only happens when someone crosses a line they can't come back from. I could feel my blood beginning to boil, and I knew Lisa felt the same way. Her knuckles whitened around the coffee pot, but she didn't react immediately. She held her ground. I watched her, and for the first time, I saw the quiet defiance in her, an everyday person who had grown tired of being dismissed by people like him, people who thought they were untouchable. Ethan shifted in his seat beside me. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he could sense the change in the room. The tension was thick, and even though it was just a few words, it felt like a spark that could light the whole town on fire. I was watching two worlds collide in that diner, one that had all the money and power in the world, and another that held something even more valuable, people. And that, I thought, was where things were going to change. Wood took another sip of his coffee, oblivious to everything that had just happened. He was a man used to getting what he wanted, used to being in control. But I could see it in Lisa's eyes. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And neither was my quiet anger, simmering beneath the surface, slowly starting to rise. The battle lines had been drawn, and I knew that before long, the people like Lisa and me would have to stand up to men like Alexander would. Because we weren't invisible anymore. We couldn't afford to be. The evening had descended quietly over the town, the dim glow of streetlights casting long shadows across the square as the crowd gathered outside the town hall. The sound of murmurs filled the air, people talking, catching up, speculating. No one was sure what to expect, but everyone knew that tonight, something had to change. Inside, the room was modest, old wooden floors creaked underfoot, and folding chairs filled the space, packed tight with locals, most of them wearing the tired expressions of those who'd lived through decades of small-town life. The air was thick with a nervous anticipation, the kind you get when you're about to witness something important, something that might shift everything you know about the world. I stood at the back of the room, my eyes on Ethan, who was sitting with a friend, drawing shapes on a scrap of paper. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. Tonight was different. The town hall meetings had always been the same. A few complaints, some small-town politicking, and then we'd all go home, quietly defeated, but nothing ever really changed. But this time was different. Tonight, Alexander Wood was here. He stood at the front of the room, tall and composed, his sharp suit glinting under the fluorescent lights. Behind him, a projector screen flickered to life, showing a polished slideshow of sleek condos, modern buildings, and sprawling parking lots. The crowd watched in silence as he made his pitch: economic growth, new jobs, a brighter future for the town. His voice was smooth, controlled. He spoke about the future, about progress, about money, the kind of money that could transform this town, raise property values, and give everyone the opportunity to live in luxury. He made it sound like a dream, a future where everyone could live better, with better schools, better roads, better everything. And then, as the slide shifted to images of the old neighborhood that would be torn down to make way for his vision, Lisa stood up. I didn't hear her at first, not until the room went quiet. It wasn't the kind of silence you'd expect after a grand pitch. No, this was the kind of silence that had an edge to it. A slow, creeping tension that seemed to fall over the room like a fog. Lisa stood there, her figure small but unmistakable. She was still in her waitress uniform, her apron tied tightly around her waist, the faded blue of her dress sure to contrast to the well-dressed men in the front row. Her eyes were nervous, shifting between the crowd and Alexander, but there was something else too, something steady beneath the surface. She cleared her throat. I just have a question, she began, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard it before. What happens to the families who'll be displaced by all this? People who can't afford to leave, who don't have anywhere else to go? The words hung in the air. The room felt like it was holding its breath. Alexander's response was immediate, almost mechanical. He didn't even look at Lisa as he spoke, his eyes still on his slideshow. That's not our concern, he said flatly, his voice smooth but cold. Progress comes with some losses. We can't let a few people stand in the way of the future. A murmur passed through the crowd, a ripple of disbelief, but it was quickly swallowed up by the quiet. Lisa's hands clenched into fists at her sides, but she didn't back down. She took a deep breath, her voice steady but with an undeniable edge. I see, she said, the words coming slowly, as if she were carefully choosing each one. And what about the people who can't afford to relocate? What happens to them? I mean, I'm one of those people. My apartment building is being torn down. I won't have anywhere to go. There was a shift in the room. People looked at each other, uncomfortable, but unsure of how to react. Alexander's eyes flicked to Lisa for a moment, just a moment, before he let out a dismissive laugh. Lisa, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. Perhaps you should leave the business side of things to those of us who understand how the world works. I'm sure you'll find another place to live. After all, this is all for the greater good, right? The crowd fell silent. A few heads turned to look at Lisa, but she didn't flinch. She stood there, her shoulders straight, her eyes fixed on Alexander. But even as she held her ground, I could see the anger simmering in her eyes, the hurt, the way she was holding back a lifetime of frustration, of never being listened to, of being dismissed by men like him, men who thought they could walk all over people like her. I knew I couldn't let her stand alone anymore. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was the way Alexander had dismissed her, like she was nothing more than a waitress. Maybe it was the way he talked about the people in this town as though they were obstacles to be moved out of the way. Whatever it was, it snapped something inside me. I stood up, the chair scraping loudly across the floor as I rose to my feet. My legs felt shaky, but my voice didn't. I understand business just fine, Mr. Wood, I said, my words measured, deliberate. But you don't understand people. You don't understand what it's like to be on the other side of your progress, the side that gets bulldozed to make room for your greater good. You see, you want to build luxury condos on this land, but you're forgetting something. You're forgetting the people who live here. People who've spent their whole lives here. People like me. I could feel the eyes of the room on me. I could feel the weight of the moment settle on my shoulders, But it didn't matter. I wasn't just standing for myself. I was standing for Lisa, for Mrs. Wilson, for everyone who had been pushed aside and ignored for too long. I work at the factory you want to shut down, Mr. Wood, I continued. I fix the machines that make this town run. Lisa serves your coffee. Mrs. Wilson taught half this town's kids. You can't just bulldoze that. You can't just ignore it because it's inconvenient to your plan. We matter. The silence in the room was deafening, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel invisible. For the first time, the people in this room, people who had always been quiet, who had always just gotten by, were looking at me, seeing me. They were hearing me. Wood stood there, his mouth slightly agape, clearly stunned by the force of my words. He opened his mouth to speak, but I could see something in his eyes, a flicker of doubt, something he wasn't used to feeling. For the first time, he was caught off guard. The crowd was no longer silent. Murmurs rose from every corner of the room. People were nodding, some even clapping softly. Lisa's eyes met mine, and for a brief moment, I saw something there, gratitude, maybe, but also the kind of quiet pride you get when you see someone stand up for you when you couldn't do it yourself. Alexander Wood straightened his posture, cleared his throat, and tried to recover. Well, Mr. Fletcher, he said, his voice tight now, no longer as assured, perhaps you and your friends should leave the development to those of us who have the means to see it through. But the crowd wasn't listening to him anymore. They were listening to us. It was a turning point, one that would echo throughout the town, one that would set the stage for everything that came after. That night, we weren't just bystanders in our own lives. We were part of the conversation, and that was the beginning of something new. The morning was soft, the light pouring through the windows of Marlene's diner, but it felt different somehow. The air had changed. There was a quiet hum, a kind of unspoken shift. Maybe it was just me, or maybe it was the way people were looking at each other, like the town had woken up from a long sleep. For once, we weren't invisible. We were seen. I walked in with Ethan, the usual clatter of cups and the scent of frying bacon greeting us. But there was something new in the way people nodded, in the way they gave quiet smiles, in the way the world seemed to take a breath. We weren't just the background noise anymore. And that, for me, was something I hadn't expected. Lisa was already there, moving behind the counter, wiping down surfaces, but when she saw us, her eyes softened. It wasn't the usual tired politeness. It was something deeper, something that said we had shared a moment, a dangerous but necessary moment, the night before. She came over to our booth, holding a coffee pot in her hands. Without asking, she refilled my cup, and then placed a steaming mug in front of Ethan. "Coffee's on the house today, James," she said with a small smile. For what you did yesterday. For standing up. I didn't know what to say. I wasn't expecting thanks. Hell, I wasn't expecting anything. I had just spoken what I believed was right, what I thought needed to be said. But in that moment, it felt like something bigger. Like I had done something worth remembering. Something that could make a difference. I nodded, unsure how to respond. Words felt small in the face of what had just happened. Ethan, ever the innocent, asked, "Does that mean we get free chocolate milk every day?" Lisa chuckled softly. "Only if you keep drawing those houses, buddy." We laughed, but it was different now, no longer the tired, weary laughter of people who had seen too much of the same thing. This was a kind of relief, a lightness that I hadn't felt in a long time. Just then, the bell over the door jingled. I looked up, my stomach dropping into my shoes. It was him, Alexander Wood. The entire diner went quiet. The chatter died. Forks clinked, mugs paused midair. It wasn't the usual tense silence that followed his presence. No, this was different. It was a hush of curiosity, a kind of respect, maybe. He stood in the doorway for a second, scanning the room as if he was unsure of himself, uncertain. For the first time, he wasn't walking in with the brash confidence that had marked his every move since his return to town. This was different. He wasn't the millionaire who came in like he owned the place. This was something human. His eyes found me, and then, just like that, he walked over. The room held its breath. I couldn't read his face at first, and for a second, I wondered if he was about to confront me. The last time we'd spoken, it had been a battle of wills, his arrogant certainty against my stubborn defiance. But now it was like the walls had cracked. There was no arrogance in his posture, no cocky smirk, just a man, no, a person, standing before me with a kind of humility I hadn't expected. He stood at our table for a moment, his hands stuffed deep in his pockets, his eyes flicking to Ethan before meeting mine. He hesitated, his voice low. "May I sit?" he asked, his tone softer than I'd ever heard it. It wasn't a demand. It was a request. I didn't know what to say. I glanced at Lisa, who had stopped what she was doing, eyes wide but still. She wasn't sure either, but she stepped back, giving us space. It was like time had slowed down, like the diner had become a stage for something raw and vulnerable. I nodded slowly, unsure if this was a trick or if this was real. Alexander slid into the booth across from us. He didn't sit like a king this time. His shoulders were slumped slightly, as if the weight of something had finally sunk in. I owe you an apology," he started, his voice almost breaking. There was no pride in his words, no pretense. "What I said yesterday. I didn't understand. I didn't think it through." He paused, glancing down at the table, and for the first time, I saw something different in him. Something I couldn't quite place. He wasn't the man who walked in with his chest puffed out, demanding respect. He was a man who was beginning to realize the cost of his ambition. "I grew up in a place like this," he continued, his voice low. "My father worked at that factory. He worked his whole life in that factory. He died there. I thought coming back here, showing everyone how successful I'd become, would make me feel, I don't know, like I belonged. But last night, listening to you and Lisa, I realized something. I realized I had forgotten where I came from. I had forgotten the people who made me. It was raw. It was real." Ethan, ever the innocent observer, blinked up at him, a little confused by the sudden shift in mood. "Are you sorry for what you said?" he asked, his voice small but clear. Alexander met his eyes, and for the first time, I saw the man behind the suit. His expression softened, and he nodded. "Yes, kid. I'm sorry." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavier than anything I'd heard from him before. He wasn't just apologizing for what he said. He was acknowledging something bigger, something personal. He was reckoning with who he had become in the pursuit of success. The moment stretched on, and the weight of it settled over us all. For a brief second, I thought maybe, just maybe, we had started something here. Something that couldn't be undone. Alexander stood, slowly, and turned to leave. But before he did, he looked back at me. "I'm going to make some changes," he said, his voice firm again, but this time it was different. "For the people who matter." With that, he walked out, and the diner breathed a collective sigh. Ethan looked up at me, his wide eyes full of questions. But I didn't have all the answers. Not yet. But I did know one thing. For the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe things could change. Maybe we all could. 3 weeks had passed since that strange morning in the diner, and the weight of everything that had happened still lingered in the air. Change wasn't something that happened overnight, but there were small signs that the town was slowly shifting. The most glaring of all, the quiet hum of optimism that seemed to have crept into the rhythm of our lives. It wasn't grand, it wasn't loud, but it was there, in the way people moved through their days with a little more energy, a little more hope. I had learned that hope wasn't something you found in the quiet, everyday grind of life. It was something you found when the unexpected happened, when a voice you didn't expect to hear stood up and said, "Enough." That's exactly what Alexander had done. I still couldn't quite believe it. 3 weeks had passed, and I'd been waiting for the other shoe to drop. For Alexander to pull a fast one, to go back to the person he had been before. But I hadn't heard from him, not once, until the day the blueprints came across the town's desk. It wasn't just any set of blueprints, either. This time, the plans were different. They weren't about tearing down the old to make way for something no one could afford. No, these plans were about keeping what mattered. Alexander had taken a step that nobody, including me, had ever thought he would take. He decided to redesign it all. The town hall was packed, the air buzzing with confusion and curiosity. Alexander stood at the front of the room, surrounded by architects and members of the town council. He didn't look like the man who had once breezed in with his millionaire swagger. This was someone different, someone who had taken the time to listen, to understand. "I've listened," he began, his voice steady but not commanding. There was no ego in it, no entitlement, just a man who had made a choice. The original plan was flawed. I didn't see it at first, but I see it now. This town deserves better. A murmur ran through the room. People exchanged looks, wondering if they were hearing things correctly. Was this the same man who had called the homes in the neighborhood properties to be bought and sold at will? Alexander gestured to the new blueprint on the screen. "These homes will remain. We'll preserve what we can. Renovate the factory. And I'm putting affordable housing at the center of this development." The room was stunned into silence. People had come here expecting another presentation of luxury condos, another reminder that their town was being priced out of its own history. Instead, they were being offered a future where people like them, people who had worked and lived and built their lives in this place, could stay. The ripple effect was immediate. The town buzzed with conversations in coffee shops, on street corners, in living rooms. Everyone was talking about Alexander's new plan. There was excitement in the air, a newfound sense of possibility. I was still trying to wrap my head around it when I heard that Alexander had visited Mrs. Wilson's house. Mrs. Wilson, the woman who had lived next door to us for years, who had taught half of the town's kids in the 3rd grade, who had seen it all and lost much of it in the process. She was the heart of this town in so many ways, and the idea that she would be forced out for some high-rise condos had broken something inside me. But Alexander hadn't just made the decision to keep the houses standing. He'd gone the extra step. He'd gone to Mrs. Wilson's house, sat with her, and listened to the stories she had to tell. The pictures she showed him, the history in her voice. Alexander was no longer just a businessman looking for a quick deal. He was a neighbor, someone who had started to care about more than just the bottom line. As I drove past Mrs. Wilson's house that afternoon, I could see her sitting on the porch, her hands folded in her lap, a quiet smile on her face. Alexander had kept his word. He'd listened, and more importantly, he'd acted. The change wasn't just in the plans for the buildings, it was in the people, too. Meanwhile, Lisa and I kept to our routines, as we always had. She still worked behind the counter, refilling coffee cups, and I still worked at the factory, fixing machines, making sure everything ran smoothly. But now, there was something different in the air. A kind of hope we hadn't had before. Maybe it was because of the way the town had started to pull together. Maybe it was the way people were speaking up more. Or maybe it was because we were seeing the kind of change that we'd all been waiting for. There was an energy now, something that hadn't been there before. People were talking. And this time, it wasn't about just surviving. It was about thriving. It was about believing in something better, something we hadn't dared to dream of. For me, the change wasn't just about the new buildings, or the fact that Mrs. Wilson could stay in her home. It was about the shift in how we all saw each other. The shift from being invisible to being seen. The shift from being simple folk to being a part of something that mattered. Alexander's transformation was something I couldn't have predicted. And neither could anyone else. The man who had once come in with only his own interests in mind was now a part of the community, working alongside us. Not as an outsider, but as a neighbor. Maybe the hardest lesson he learned was that success wasn't just about what you could build, it was about who you could build with. 3 weeks later, the blueprints had changed. The town had changed. And maybe, just maybe, we were all starting to believe that real progress could look like something different. It could look like keeping homes, preserving history, and most of all, it could look like community. And as for me, I had my son beside me, a town that was finally awake, and a future that didn't seem so impossible anymore. The afternoon sun bathed the town in a warm golden light, casting long shadows and creating a sense of possibility in the air. It wasn't just another sunny day, it was the day everything changed. The groundbreaking ceremony was more than just the start of a construction project. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that would transform the community without tearing it apart. The crowd gathered outside, a mixture of familiar faces, neighbors, old friends, and even a few strangers who'd heard about the recent changes. There was a palpable energy in the air, a buzz that hadn't been present in the town in years. People were talking, laughing, greeting one another as they stood beneath the blue sky, the dusty earth beneath their feet awaiting the shovel's first strike. Alexander Wood, standing at the podium, wasn't the man he had been when he first arrived in town. His sharp suit, the one that had once screamed of money and power, now seemed less imposing. His stance was different too. He was no longer the billionaire making cold decisions behind a desk in a far-off city. He was a man who had listened, who had seen the faces of the people he was impacting, and who, now, was standing with them, not above them. He cleared his throat before speaking. "I came here thinking I had all the answers," he began, his voice steady but softer than before. "But I was wrong. I came here looking to build something, but I never stopped to think about what was already here. I didn't understand that the heart of a town isn't in its buildings, it's in the people. And for that, I apologize." There was a brief pause, a few murmurs in the crowd. For a moment, it was hard to believe this was the same man who had dismissed people like Lisa, like me, as insignificant. But there he was, humbled and sincere, acknowledging what we had all hoped for, a future where we mattered. "I'm proud to be a part of this community now," Alexander continued. And I promise that this development will work for all of us. It will preserve our homes, keep the factory running, and create a space where our children and grandchildren can thrive. The applause that followed was louder than I had expected. The townspeople, many of whom had been skeptical of Alexander's intentions, were now seeing the tangible results of his change of heart. This wasn't just about luxury condos anymore. This was about creating something real, something that would benefit the people who had lived here long before the first blueprint was drawn. Beside me, Lisa stood with her daughter, both of them smiling, their faces glowing with pride. We had made it through the hard fight. And now, this ceremony, this moment, was a celebration of everything we had worked for, the voices we had raised, the courage we had found, and the community that had stood by us. Ethan, his face alight with excitement, ran ahead, his small feet carrying him toward what would soon be our backyard. I watched him, heart swelling, as he leaped over patches of grass that would soon be part of our new home. The drawing he had made, that little sketch of a house with a backyard and a garden, was no longer just a dream. It was becoming real. As he ran through the space, I couldn't help but think of all the mornings I'd spent wondering how we would ever make it out of our cramped apartment, how I would ever give him the life I thought he deserved. Now, here we were, standing on the edge of something better. The sound of music began to fill the air as the celebration continued. Local bands played upbeat tunes, and the aroma of food from the food trucks added to the festive atmosphere. People mingled, exchanging stories, laughing, and enjoying the sense of community that had been revived by the changes that had taken place. Lisa came over to me, her daughter holding tightly onto her hand. "Can you believe this?" she asked, her voice full of wonder. I shook my head, still trying to wrap my mind around it all. "I don't think I'll ever believe it," I replied, a smile tugging at the corner of my lips. "But I'm glad it happened." We shared a look then, one of mutual respect and understanding. It was a quiet acknowledgement of everything we had endured and everything we had achieved. From the early days of doubt, of being overlooked, to this moment, standing together, part of something bigger than ourselves. The ribbon cutting came later, and the first shovel was lifted ceremoniously from the ground. The earth turned, symbolizing the start of a new era for the town. There was hope in the air now, hope that didn't come at the cost of dignity, but at the heart of it. People weren't being pushed aside to make room for progress. Progress was coming because people had stood up for what was right. As the crowd cheered, I glanced at Ethan again, his eyes shining with wonder as he ran alongside the other children who had gathered. He was full of energy, full of possibility. For the first time in a long while, I felt like the future was something to look forward to. I looked over at Lisa, and for a brief moment, our hands almost touched. There was a quiet understanding between us. We'd helped make this happen. We'd fought for it, and we'd won. This was more than a victory. This was a chance for all of us, simple folk, working-class families, people who had been left behind in the rush for progress, to have a place in that progress. This town wasn't just a place on the map anymore. It was a community, a living, breathing thing, held together by the people who loved it. As the day drew to a close, the sun setting behind the trees, I stood there, watching my son and Lisa's daughter run across the field. The world felt a little different now, a little brighter. Maybe this was what real success looked like. Not the buildings, not the plans, but the lives, the people, the families who would carry it all forward. We had made it, and for the first time, I truly believed that we all had a place in the future. The evening air was soft and warm, wrapping itself around the small backyard like an old, familiar blanket. The smell of grilled food mingled with the earthy scent of freshly tilled soil, and in the distance, the sounds of laughter and chatter filled the air. The kind of sounds that made the heart swell with quiet contentment. James stood by the barbecue, flipping burgers while Ethan and Lisa's daughter ran through the yard, their laughter echoing in the fading sunlight. The modest house behind them had only just become home, but it already felt like a sanctuary. It wasn't much, small, simple, and modest, but to James, it was everything. It was a place where dreams could finally take root. Lisa sat nearby, her feet propped up on a wooden chair, sipping a cold drink. Her face was relaxed, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. She looked more at peace than James had ever seen her, a softness about her that came from knowing her struggles had been worth it, that she, too, had earned this quiet joy. And then, from the end of the yard, a figure appeared. Alexander Wood. But this time, he wasn't in a suit, wasn't the man who walked into Marlene's diner with all the arrogance and entitlement of someone who thought he owned the world. No, today, Alexander was dressed casually, jeans, a shirt, and in his hands, a small basket of tomatoes. He wasn't an outsider anymore. He was part of the scene now, part of this change. James noticed him first and gave him a nod, still flipping the burgers. "Didn't think I'd be seeing you out here," he said with a half-smile. Alexander approached, a sheepish grin on his face. "I brought these," he said, holding out the tomatoes. "For the garden. I heard you've got quite the green thumb." James laughed softly, gesturing to the small vegetable patch near the fence. "It's nothing fancy. Just trying to make something grow." Ethan ran up, his face alight with excitement, holding a toy truck in his hand. "Dad, look. I found a bug," he said, dropping to the grass to examine it. "You got it, buddy?" James called out, glancing over his shoulder. "Yup. It's a beetle. I think it's a good luck one." Lisa chuckled, looking over at Alexander. "He has a knack for finding things, bugs, rocks, you name it." Alexander watched the boy with a quiet appreciation, his expression more genuine than it had ever been. He looked at James, then back at the children. "I never thought I'd see this," he said, his voice low. James turned the burgers again, his gaze lingering on the boy. "What, this?" he asked. "The backyard barbecue? Kids playing? Tomatoes in the garden?" Alexander nodded slowly. "Yeah, it's different from what I expected." His gaze swept over the scene. "I thought I was doing something good when I first came here. But I guess I didn't really understand what was important. I only saw what could be sold." A moment of quiet passed between them, each of them contemplating the weight of the changes that had come, both personal and communal. The breeze shifted slightly, rustling the leaves of the trees in the yard. James finally broke the silence. He looked at Alexander, his voice steady but carrying a weight of its own. "Not bad for a couple of nobodies, huh?" Alexander blinked, taken aback by the statement. James wasn't bitter, just matter of fact. There was no spite in his tone, just the quiet, unassuming strength that had defined him all along. Lisa, who had been quietly watching the conversation unfold, set down her drink and leaned back in her chair, her eyes meeting James's. "I don't think we were ever nobodies," she said, her voice warm yet firm. "Some people just needed reminding." The words hung in the air for a moment, simple but powerful. Lisa's quiet defiance, her courage in the face of all that had been stacked against them, now resonated in the stillness of the backyard. She was right. They had never been nobodies. They had simply been overlooked. But now they were seen. And in their own quiet way, they had changed everything. James looked over at Lisa, their eyes meeting with a shared understanding. He didn't need to say anything more. They both knew. A soft breeze swirled through the yard, carrying the sounds of children's laughter as they ran past. The sky had deepened into hues of orange and purple, the night falling gently around them. The future, it seemed, was unfolding right in front of them. A future built on something stronger than money or development or plans. It was built on people, on love, on simple moments. James took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything that had led them here. "I never thought my life would change over coffee and toast," he said quietly, almost to himself, the words echoing the thought that had begun this whole journey. And as the evening settled around them, he realized that change hadn't come just from that breakfast, from that first conversation. No, it had come from the courage to speak up, to stand together, to fight for something bigger than themselves. And it had been worth every moment. The final shot mirrored the first, quiet and simple, yet now filled with dignity, with belonging, and with the undeniable sense that they had finally found their place. If this story moved you, if you've ever been made to feel small in a world that worships the big and powerful, know this: your voice matters. Your dignity matters. And you are never alone. If you found strength in this story, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment below. I'd love to know, have you ever experienced a moment where someone finally stood up for you, or where you had to stand up for yourself? And if you want more true stories that cut deep, challenge expectations, and remind us what it means to be human, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for being here.